Hello and welcome to the Dead Parent Club, part of Good Grief Festival. My name is Cariad Lloyd. Hello, I am, lots of things. You may know me from my podcast, the Griefcast, as well as other things. And I'm delighted to be joined by two excellent people today. I'm firstly joined by Nikesh Shukla. Hello, Nikesh, how are you?
Hey Cariad, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm going to make you introduce yourself because I did it. So I'm going to say, Nikesh, please introduce yourself to everybody watching. You're a
Hi,
writer. I'll start with that. I'll give you that. You're a writer.
I'm a writer, uh, boring dad of two. Uh, yeah, I'm an author. I write for teenagers and for adults, and I guess I'm most known for editing a collection of essays called The Good Immigrant, and that's probably it.
I really thought you had the book then. I was like, that is so smooth. You like had it and then you just held it up. I was like, mate, come on, show us if it's there. Because
I,
it's
I am right next to like
oh yes.
my vanity shelf,
We all need
just
that.
to remind myself of like the oeuvre.
And I'm also joined by another writer, Olivia Potts. Or can we call you Livy? Is that right,
Call me Livy, yes.
Livy, you have to now introduce yourself. Sorry.
It's all right because because you made Nikesh at first. I had warning. Okay, I'm Livy, and I am the author of A Half-Baked Idea. I used to be a criminal barrister, and when my mother died unexpectedly, I left my career at the criminal bar to retrain in patisserie, and that is the story that A Half-Baked Idea tells.
It's such a great sentence. Like immediately, you're like, I left to train in, and you're like, what did she do? Patisserie, and you're like, I'm on
Yeah, you
board.
don't see that one coming. Well, you do because you know. But
I know, yeah. And I feel like we because this is Dead Parent Club, this particular Zoom. Um, God, apologies if you like just sat down with a glass of wine for a Saturday to join Dead Parent Club. I feel like we should also say which parent. Should we do that? Should we introduce them slightly? Um, so yeah, my dad died when I was 15. So I make the joke on my show that I'm DDC, which is Dead Dad Club. Nikesh, would you like to introduce your dead parent?
Uh, my mum.
Your mum. And
Yeah.
how old were you when your mum died?
So I was 30 in like in a couple of weeks. It would have been 10 years since she died, and I've got that
Oh,
weird thing of like I don't know if how you guys feel about significant dates, but I feel like I spend the months leading up to them going, it's just a day, don't make a big deal about it. Just a day, don't make a big deal about it. And then the day comes and you've spent so long telling yourself not to make a big deal out of it. The only thing left to do is make a big deal out of it. So yeah, she'll have been dead 10 years.
I we talk about this a lot on the show that I think anything that's like 5, 10, 15, 20. Don't ask me why, what the maths is, I think it hits you harder. But so Livy, we should say, what dead parent are you bringing to the Dead Parent Club?
I'm
Sorry.
bringing my dead mother.
Dead mother.
Um,
DMCs here. One DDC, one DMC.
Yes. I'm bringing my mum who died when I was. I said this recently. I'm really rubbish on the dates and the ages. I'm fairly sure I was 25. I'm normally very good on figures, but when it comes to mum's death and her age and my age and the year, I've got a real blank over it. I was either 24 or 25 when she died. So about 8 years ago, I think. 7, 8 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, Nicholas, it's a really interesting point to come back to. Like, I found 10 hard. I found 20. Sorry, I hate saying this to people who are like behind me to be like, oh, 20 is awful, by the way. But that's just my experience. I found 20 really hard, and I found 10 really hard as well. So, like, how many months away is it for you? Is it coming like pretty soon?
Um, Weeks actually.
Oh,
Yeah.
weeks. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think a week on. Oh no! Wait, hold on. This Sunday. This
This
Sunday.
Sunday. And are you what is your plan? Do you have a plan yet? Like, because I feel like people expect after 10 years or something, like you'll know what to do. But like even at 20, I didn't quite know what to do because every year is so different.
So I so usually on Sunday during lockdown, me and my friends have been doing like a dweeby boys watch a film on Zoom club.
Nice.
Um, but this Sunday people aren't around. So because I thought it was going to be a big day, I have basically treated myself to doing a writing masterclass with the amazing writer Garth Greenwell, because he's such an amazing stylist, and like his sentences are so beautiful. And just because I've written like 5 novels, it doesn't mean I feel like I'm at the apex of my ability to write. So I just thought, I'm going to take this horrible day and I'm going to treat myself to some learning. I'm going to learn from one of the best.
That's nice. I think that's a really nice idea. Whenever we talk about it on the Griefcast Twitter, I don't know if I even introduced the show properly at the beginning. Anyway, it's a podcast called the Griefcast. Nikesh and Olivia have both been on it, listened to their episodes. For like, if you want like behind the scenes of this Zoom, you can find out more. And yeah, people often ask me on Twitter, on the Griefcast Twitter, like, oh, what should I do on the day? And I often just retweet it because I'm like, what does everybody think? It's so different. But the sort of strong theme seems to be either treat yourself or like do something they would have liked. Like it has to be, but it has to be like you said, like this kind of like treat about what is a horrible day. So some people be like, oh, they really loved like a good roast, or they liked a pint, or they liked a curry, so we're going to go and do that. Or I want this, so I'm going to go and have a day by myself. Because I think it's funny that it's not really talked about until you experience it. But Livy, you said you're a bit opposite. Does the anniversary particularly bother you, or is it like it just passes for you?
No, it does bother me a bit. But I just I'm always a bit hazy with the dates. And as I say, I'm normally like a very date person. I'm very good, I can remember the birthdays of everyone I was at school with and that sort of thing. But when it comes to these dates, they're just not there. And it was never quite clear which day Mum died on. She died in the house when she was alone, and it might have been either the 10th or the 11th. So that sort of makes it hazier. I think her death certificate's the 11th. So I used to celebrate it in a really rubbish way, which is I no longer smoke. I used to be a smoker. My mum was a lifelong smoker, had nothing to do with her death. So I used to just have a cigarette in memory of her when it was her anniversary. But smoking's not as fun when you don't do it regularly. It just makes you feel a bit sick and dizzy. So it's not actually a very good way of doing it, to be completely honest with you.
That's so funny because I'm a very heavy ex-smoker, and the thing that you do as a heavy ex-smoker is try and find excuses to have a cigarette. So I can completely understand being like,
no one can argue with a dead mum. They can't go, no, you mustn't have a cigarette. Because you go, well, I'm sorry, my mother's dead, so I think you'll find I'll be having a cigarette. But yeah, it's sort of.
It is gross, doesn't it? It's really gross if you don't smoke regularly. It just really is like you have to really force yourself to be like, what is this? Like, why did I do this?
Yeah, why am I doing it to myself? So I've pretty much stopped in that. Her ashes were scattered in the garden of the house we lived in all our lives, but we no longer have that house. So I kind of don't have anywhere to go to as well. And actually, retrospectively, I really wish I did. I wish there was somewhere that I could sort of do a little pilgrimage to or something like that to be close to her. I think that's one of the things that if I had decisions again, I would do differently, so that there was somewhere where I could go and just be a bit quiet with her.
Yeah, that's really interesting because my dad's ashes were scattered like this place in Wales, basically, that he used to go to a lot as a child, and we used to go to a lot. But I haven't been back there for. Because all my Welsh relatives are dead. Like they've all everyone moved, and there's not anybody there. There's a few. I mean, I really would be amazed if they're watching Zoom, but no idea what relatives, just in case. There are a few left, but they're very old. Nikesh, do you have somewhere you can go for your to honour her and remember her in that way?
Yeah, I guess lockdown has made it harder to kind of grieve together as a family.
Yeah.
So I no longer live in the same city as my family. I live in Bristol. They all live in northwest London still, and it really takes a global pandemic to make you realise what you will and won't drive halfway across the country for. And, so I don't really have anywhere to go. We scattered my mum's ashes in the Ganges, like where the mountains meet the Ganges, like at the source of the Ganges. And my mum, I don't know. I think I just find that the best thing to do on those days is just to keep distracted, or to not. I think I spend a lot of time trying not to like romanticize it. That's why I've booked myself to do this masterclass, because I feel like it'll give me something else to do to kind of throw my focus elsewhere.
Yeah. I think that's interesting that she's in a different country. Is that fine, or do you feel like, are you ever like, oh, I wish I could be in that place? Or because I don't, obviously Wales is very different, but I don't feel too bad that I don't have somewhere to go, because I guess in comparison to Livy, Wales was always somewhere was like we had to go to, and it was like a journey, and so I'm sort of used to it being far away. But yeah, how does it feel, Nikesh, that it is that far away, or do you feel like it's good? That's where an amazing place for her to have her ashes scattered.
I found it difficult until, weirdly, I was rewatching an episode of Desmond's, the sitcom. So this amazing artist called Selena Thompson had done a show called Salt, which was where she went on a cargo ship and traced the transatlantic slave trade, and before she actually went on the voyage in order to do the research, her grandmother died. In fact, potentially brilliant guest for the Griefcast. And I went to see like an early version of her play, and she projects a scene from an episode in Desmond's onto this wall of salt, and it just really made me think. Basically, in the episode, Desmond isn't in it for a lot of the episode. Something has happened. He's in hospital, and Shirley and Porkpie, his wife Shirley and his best friend Porkpie, are sitting in a cafe or a pub talking, and Shirley says to Porkpie, you know, neither of us ever expected to die. Neither of us ever expected to die here. We expected to come over here, make our money, and then go back to die in Guyana. But the thing is, and I just sort of realised in that moment, watching that thing, that actually that was the immigrant's dream. They didn't necessarily want to come to the UK and live out their years in the UK. They wanted to come here, make their money, and go home and die close to the source. And then Shirley goes on to say that, you know, the tragedy is she doesn't want to go back to Guyana because her home is here now. Her family's here, her community's here, her children are here. And it really made me think that I think my mother would have really liked to have died in India. She would have really liked to have gone back at some point. So the fact that that's where she rests, that means something.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's absolutely amazing that you had that experience. And we talk a lot about on the show about ritual, and I do think that's what we're all talking about, really, isn't it? Like, if you don't have a place for ritual, and I think it's just so interesting. Like, so my dad was in the wardrobe for 10 years. My mum just kept him in the wardrobe in his ashes, not literally. And so I think for us, it was always a bit vague. Like, we didn't, you know, there wasn't a grave that we went to every year. And I guess maybe that's what you mean, Livy, is like, because it was a house you used to live in, that was a home, and now you can't go there. So it's like, how do you create a ritual when your ritual has gone? Or, you know, you're finding rituals in different places. Is that what you've had to sort of discover, Livy?
Yeah, although, to be candid, I'm not sure how good I've been at that. And I think that I have changed a lot, and my life has changed a lot since my mum died. You know, when she died, I was basically single. I just started seeing this guy, but I was basically single. I was still a barrister. I was living like a kind of semi-chaotic mid-20s life in London. And now I feel, and also doing a job that I wasn't very happy in, and now I feel, you know, settled in a variety of different ways. And I don't really think that any of the things I've necessarily done to remember her has kind of stayed the test of time in a way in which it's become a ritual. I think writing the book was a tribute to her. I mean, it was also a lot about me, let's be completely honest, but it was sort of me putting my love for her and our relationship into this this physical object that I hoped would stand the test of time, and kind of shouting it from the rooftops a bit. So while I've been quite rubbish at rituals, I do see the book as a a testament to her, a testament to our relationship, and that makes it feel like it's grounded in reality, because even if I start to forget, it's still there. But I still lack rituals. I think I would love to have a family, and I think if I had a family, I would want to find a way to make sure that any children of mine that never met her felt they knew about her in quite a tangible way. So I think I need to find rituals in my life.
Yeah, I think it's hard. I think the important thing is that I've learned is that rituals change. So I definitely used to feel very strongly about the day, and I used to feel really strongly about the time, like what I was doing at the time he died, at the day he died, because I was 15 and we were with him. So like it was very much, burnt into my mind exactly when it happened, because we were in the room. And now I've got a bit softer with myself. And I say I don't really have a ritual other than all I try and do is just do something on the day. Like, even if that's light a candle, have a conversation with my mum, go to the cinema. Remember those days, guys? Which, yeah, this year was in lockdown, but I just had a baby on just before the anniversary of his death. So I can't even remember what we did because my life was chaos. And Nikesh, maybe that's something we're talking about. Like, so I have two children, they're quite small. I think yours are a bit older, Nikesh. Like, how have you kept your mum's memory alive for them? How do you have those conversations about someone who they can't experience?
Yeah, they're 3 and 6, and it's an ongoing conversation with them. I wrote about this quite a lot when I was writing columns for The Guardian about my daughter's obsession with my mum being dead. And this was kind of, I was supposed to write a book about parenthood. That's coming out next February, and it ended up being a book about losing a parent and becoming a parent. And the thing that I've found with with my eldest daughter is just to be really matter of fact about it. And she definitely had moments where just the idea of not existing anymore really freaked her out. But I sort of offhandedly once said to her that her hands really looked like my mum's hands, and that's really stayed with her, and she brings that up all the time. Whenever my mum's name is invoked, she'll say, I have her hands. In that way that she doesn't really mean anything, but like she doesn't really know what it means, but it sort of means something to her. And recently she said something that really just came out of nowhere. We were driving, and then she was just sort of looking out the window and thinking to herself, and she said, I know how we can be together forever, even when we're dead. And I was like, okay. And she said, all we have to do is just, when we die, we just need to hold hands, and then we'll be together forever. And it just broke my heart, because I think that idea that, by holding her hand and it looked like my mum's hand, it would just remind me of my mum. I think that's sort of what she was trying to process and try and get across to me in a very loving and empathetic way. But yeah, I don't think she sort of necessarily understands the physicality of death, like when someone is physically removed from your life, what that does, because she probably just hasn't experienced that yet. So conceptually, it is an ongoing conversation, I think, and it's a hard one, because she knows that I feel sad about my mum not being around, but at the same time she sort of wants to know more about her.
I think what a heartbreaking, beautiful thing to say. Your daughter is obviously going to be a writer, because that is like, she gave you some poetry and some metaphors, some similes are right there. But I think, again, we come back to this thing of like not, and I really stick by this of like not getting stuck in something. So if something works year 1 to 5, it doesn't mean it's going to work 5 to 10, 10 to 15. Like this, you grieve, it doesn't go away. You just process it differently. You learn to live with it. And I think that happens in the same way of having conversation with kids. My daughter is only like nearly 4. So I've said before, like, my dad's dead, and she's like, like, okay, great, thanks for telling me. And my husband had a really bizarre experience that he was in the playground with her which I think for some kids is unusual that there is a dad in the playground. Sometimes it is. And so this little boy was very interested in him, and he was like, you know, is like, are you the daddy? And he was like, yeah. And he was like, oh right, okay. And then he was like, where's her mummy? My husband was like, oh well, she's at home. And he was like, and he just turned to my husband and he said, where's your mummy? My husband has lost both his parents, and he was like, oh, she's dead. And then this kid just ran away saying, his mum is dead, his mum is dead, across the whole playground. And my husband was like way to go, sensitivity. Like, and it was like, he said it was so funny because he was trying to be honest with this child, and then this child just screamed it in his face. And he was like, yeah, maybe don't tell them all the time, like, be honest. But I do think it's really important that it's kind of, I mean, I find it funny that kids just don't understand it, and I think it's quite nice sometimes to have a break from those conversations, because, you know, as an adult you get very used to being like, brace yourself, I have to tell them my dad's dead. So, well, actually he died when I was 15, and it's quite nice to say it to a child who's just like, all right, like, it's just normal as you're having scrambled eggs, like, it's just, that's it. In terms of young people, I suppose there may be people watching who have just joined the club. We are all a bit veteran. What would be, if you did have like top piece of advice or top 3 things you would say to a young person who has just lost someone? Like, you know, I think again, it's obviously, it's really hard to like give individual advice because everybody's circumstance is so different and every single grief is different. But is there something, Livy, that you would like, oh, I wish someone would have told me that?
Well, the thing that I wish I'd understood, I think people probably did say to me, and I just didn't quite take it on board, because the point of grief is that it's so different to anything else you've ever experienced, and it's so all-encompassing. So I think a lot of people say, you know, everybody grieves in a different way. You know, first year is a freebie, you just have to get through it, and however you deal with that, whether it's, you know, objectively good or bad, is fine. And I sort of knew all of that, but I've talked a lot about the fact that I dealt with grief in quite a controlling way. To me, it was extremely important that I cope and be seen to be coping and feel like I was coping. And to all intents and purposes, I was, you know, I went straight back to my job within a couple of days. I organised the funeral. I was doing sort of traumatic stuff in the criminal courts, the criminal barrister. It took me quite a few years to kind of process the grief that I'd quite deliberately not dealt with, because I needed to feel in control. And when it came to dealing with that grief, I beat myself up about it a lot. I kept thinking, you know, if I just kind of opened myself up to it, if I hadn't been so controlling in the first place, if I dealt with it properly in the way that people wanted me to, I wouldn't have had all these issues that I now felt I did. I wouldn't have had this kind of repressed trauma within me, and perhaps I just wouldn't be so deeply unhappy all of the time. And it wasn't until I went to therapy that my therapist said, this was just your brain protecting you. You were going through the most difficult period of your life. These awful things were happening. You didn't know what was going on, and your brain gave you a coping mechanism to get through that. And now you are through the other side, and you are ready to engage with those feelings of sadness and anger and loss, and deal with those properly in a way that for the last however many years, you were not mentally equipped to deal with that. But the whole point is that you survived. And I wish that I'd understood from an earlier stage that actually just getting through is enough, and there will be time to process in whatever way you need to further down the line. And it doesn't mean that you don't feel deeply because you either do or don't process, or because you fall apart or stay together or appear cold or want to talk to everyone about it. It just doesn't matter. You get through it, and your brain will catch up with the rest of you. But perhaps it's okay, deal with grief straight away, if that is what your brain wants you to do. And I was so brutal to myself about the fact that I'd caused all these problems in my own poor little mental health. And actually, what my mental health had done was protect itself for quite a while, until I was in a place where it was possible to deal with it. So, I mean, it sort of boils down to be kind to yourself, which is always my advice for anyone dealing with grief. But you just get through, and then you can deal with it.
I think that's so important, that, and I hate feeling like this sometimes, but I hate that, like, as a grief elder, as myself and Perna Bell called ourselves once, like, when you are like quite a few years down the line, you can look back at something and you can say, this is what people sort of mean by time heals. Like, time heals is a shit thing to say, especially when you're in year one and you're like, fuck you. But all it means is, if there is enough time, you can look back and go, oh, I wasn't doing it wrong. I wasn't incorrect. I was just doing the best I could at the time with what the resources I had. And I definitely, like, I can really relate to that. Like, I mean, I'm just coming out of therapy. I think she's just said I might be allowed a break. And it took me years and years and years to, one, even get to therapy, 18 years to get to therapy. And then I was very, very angry, and I really did the same thing, berated myself, like, well, I did it wrong. I was so angry. I pushed everyone away. Of course, no one wanted to help me. I was a nightmare. And now I'm like, God, you didn't know what else to do. You were a teenager. Like, so I think that's what unfortunately, when you're in, I think, years 1 to 5, it's very hard to have any perspective. You're just dealing with tornado of grief. And then, like, sort of 5 to 10, you can kind of turn around and be like, hang on a minute, what have I been doing? Why have I been doing it? Is that how you felt, Nikesh? Did you have like a kind of, oh, I now see why I was doing that moment, or was it more jumbled?
It's hard to say because I feel like I didn't properly grieve for my mum for a really long time, and actually, weirdly, like, writing this book last summer, I felt like I was grieving her for the first time properly, in a weird way. And it was actually like I had a really good revelation when I came on your podcast. When we were kind of, I think, I don't know if I didn't listen back to it because I can't listen back to my own voice because my own voice is horrendous. But I can't remember if we talked about it on mic or off mic, but I think we were talking about kids and parenthood and being tired. And I also still very clearly from that day remember walking out of the studio and slipping down on some ice as you were looking out of the window, and for months thought, I really hope Cariad didn't see me do that, because it was very embarrassing.
I didn't, because I was like, I was like, didn't see, because I have no memory of that. I mean, also I've forgotten loads of stuff since I had another baby, but I genuinely have no memory, and I really enjoy people falling over, so I would have remembered it.
It would have been a good one to see. But I think the realization I had this is kind of the thesis of this book, is that grief and parenthood often do the same thing to your brain, in that they flatten time for you. And just going back to that idea of, with time things get easier, or time heals, or like, or what some people say about both grief and parenting, that it doesn't get easier, you just get more resilient. But I think sometimes I feel like my mum has been dead for 5 days, and for 3 years, and for 10 years, and for my entire life, and for an hour, all at the same time. And also, when you've got small children, you feel like they are 1 and 5 days old and 20 all at the same time. And so, like, that flattening of time has been a really interesting thing to kind of look at and understand, because, like, you then realize that I think for the longest time I just sort of worried that I should be living life, and like my mum wouldn't want me to be sitting around moping about her. She'd want me to be living and embracing things. But at the same time, like, because time messes with your perception of time, it's okay to not worry about time. I don't even know if that is a sentence that made sense. I just said time about 14 times.
You're not the only person who said that on the show. Like, we've talked about, and obviously if you don't have children, you have, doesn't mean you don't understand this point of grief, but it's a very weird moment in your life when you do have children after a grief. Like, for me, it was so similar. Like, I couldn't believe how similar it was. And I always talk about on the show that, like, death is an absence of someone. Like, there's a gap, there's a visible gap, And so you're sort of left like, oh, what's that? Like, it used to be something there. And then birth is a present. So then you're like, oh, what is this? Like, that didn't used to be there. Now I've got to move myself around this baby. And I think they're just, you know, opposite sides of the same question, or whatever the phrase is. And I think it's really, I think that what you said, I was just thinking about that, about time, because it's like, because I was so young, I'm getting to the point where I really struggle to see a world where he was around. Like, and I know young grievers find that quite tricky, because you're like, there's no adult memories of him, of myself. So it's hard to kind of, it never feels like 5 minutes to me. It always feels like years and years and years and years. But that's why I think I found 20 hard, because I was like, oh, it's been years. But then 20 was like official. It was like stamp. You know how you feel? Stamp, it's 20. That's how long it is. And I was like, fuck, like, really not. Oh my God. It felt so official. And I think both of you, like, it's all always about not judging yourself, isn't it? I suppose that's really what we all feel. It's just like, however you feel, try and just feel it. If it doesn't make sense, maybe it will in 5 years. Like, that's how I feel. Like, anything that was confusing to me, eventually I sort of turned around and was like, oh, right, I think I was doing that because of that. But at the time, often with grief, you're just like, I have no idea why I'm, doing this thing right now. But like, I am. I mean, I remember like heavily smoking, and my dad died of cancer, which wasn't related to he had smoked as well, but not for years and years, and enjoyed himself in other ways. And it apparently wasn't related. And if I could say that, my mum will kill me. And I remember people saying to me, start from this, oh, how are you still smoking? Your dad died, don't you worry? And I was like, because my dad's dead. Like, why are you all not smoking? Like, life is so ridiculous. I don't know what else to do. And, I think these days, like, you see a lot of people attached to their phones, attached to social media. Like, we need somewhere sometimes to have a place of rest from the insanity, obviously, particularly at the moment in a global pandemic. But I definitely felt that with grief, like having somewhere, for me, smoking, I've made this the smoking club, but for me, smoking was like a moment to just like shut the world away from what I was having to deal with. And I think what I'm trying to say is try not to judge yourself, as long as obviously your decisions are not too harmful to yourself or to other people. But we do weird things in grief. It's okay. Like you said, your brain is processing the most insane thing that will probably ever happen to you in your life. So I wanted to talk about something that was I've heard of, but hadn't read a lot about till recently, about Malcolm Gladwell's theory of eminent orphans. If you don't know this theory, I'm going to really boil it down, Mr. Gladwell, I do apologise. But basically, that if you lose a parent, it kind of, this is the Cariad version. If you lose a parent, it kind of gives you a kick up the arse, and you sort of, you strive more, or you're more resilient, or you don't care about things. And when I first came across it, I was a bit like, I don't know how I feel about this. And then I was like, but actually, I can relate to it. Because definitely a lot of decisions that I've made, or a lot of choices that I've made, I have had this thing in the back of my mind of like, my dad's dead. Like, the worst thing did happen. So I might as well go on this stage and do this show, write that thing, do that audition. Because for me, that was the scary thing. Livy, how do you feel about it as a theory? Because it's odd, isn't it? It's like, congratulations.
I feel like a bit of a fraud within the theory, because the theory's particularly about young, yes, your age and below, basically. Whereas I was sort of 24, 25. But I think even extrapolating it obviously made a huge difference to my life, losing my mum, in that I left this career that I thought I'd always wanted and was actually deeply unhappy in, and went and did something totally different. I don't know whether or not it made me more resilient or sort of more focused. I think I've got a little bit of the whole life's short frame of mind. I think probably I go the other way to the, well, my mum's dead, so that's the worst thing that can happen, which is, I was worried the worst thing in the world was going to happen, and then it did, so every worry that I have is legitimate, and I might even be psychic. I should do nothing ever. So there's a lot of fighting against that. But I do think it made me more focused. I do think it made me want to go out and live a life that I was happy with. And I think my sister felt quite similarly as well, that, you know, what are you going to do with your one precious life? But how much that was down to resilience or just a kind of life change, I don't know. I don't think I felt like I had more to prove or that I had more to give. But it is undeniable that my life changed significantly and kind of to a point where it's unrecognisable from what it was before my mum died, and that was a very clear change point. I was unhappy with my job before, but, you know, I wasn't applying for patisserie school. It was something that changed massively. But I think I am still quite hamstrung by the anxiety that goes along with having lost a parent and knowing that the bad things do happen.
Yeah, I mean, I have terrible anxiety, and I think I kind of had it a bit before my dad died. I was a bit of a worrier. And then my dad died, and I was like, boom, there you go. Proof. Thank you, universe. Do not leave the house. Do not go on holiday. Like, but then weirdly, I did all those things. Like, I would then go and do really adventurous things, almost as if like, because then I would stay anxious, because I'd be like, let's see if it will happen, if I will die. So I would sort of push myself in this weird way. I guess one of the things I worry about it slightly is, and this might sound a weird thing to say, like, I worry about the importance that sometimes that we place on grief, which is a weird thing for someone who does a grief podcast to say. But like, I've definitely made massive decisions. Have they always been influenced by my dad dying? I don't, like, you know, I agree. I think, like, I would say the first few years after he died, like, I was untouchable. There was nothing you could have said to me. I was like, because who gives a shit? I'm a teenager whose dad just died. Like, say what you like. And it definitely made me brave sometimes and strong and resilient. But I've also had turn around my life moments, which I don't know had anything to do with my dad, and actually had a lot more to do with, but then maybe they did, because maybe it was like rebuilding my self-esteem. It's hard for me because when you're 15, you know, if you rebuild your life at, like, I would say sort of about 27, 28, I did what you did, Livy, of like, right, I've got to change everything, sort my life out, become a comedian, this is what I'm going to do. But like, is that connected to being 15? Like, or is it just like, oh, I just kind of worked out, if I don't do this, I'm going to live with my mum for the rest of my life. And I don't want to do that. Nikesh, how do you feel about it as a theory and resilience, what it gives you?
So for the longest time, like, having, you know, being a writer and my mum always being slightly bemused by that, and, you know, wanting me to just sort of be comfortable and all the rest of it, she pushed me hard, and she pushed me hard, you know, just to be comfortable, but also to kind of be the best. And so I felt like when she was alive, I was always striving to prove something to her. And then she was diagnosed with cancer. Obviously, I talked about this on the podcast, but she was diagnosed with cancer, and then died like 2 weeks later. And then a week after that, my first novel came out, and so I kind of had the two things going on at the same time. And I've often thought a lot about how very often grief gets frozen, or grief gets put in stasis from the last interaction you have with someone. And there was one weekend where I was at, you know, I was in my childhood home. I was looking after my mum. I was hanging out with her, getting increasingly frustrated with her. You know, she just sort of seemed like she'd given up. And then I needed to go into London to do a radio interview at night. But then the plan was to go back to my mum's house. And I made my mum promise she would listen. And I went and did the interview. Thought nothing of it. It was just one of those promo interviews. And then it was like 11:45 p.m. I was in Oxford Circus outside New Broadcasting House, and I was just like, I'm not going back to Harrow. My flat is like 12 minutes on the Victoria Line. So I went back to my flat, sleep in the same bed as my wife, and just sort of have some sort of normality. And next day I just sort of went on with my day, and just I phoned my mum, just say, oh, I'm sorry I didn't come back, I'll come see you in the week, and all this sort of stuff. And my mum was like, she was really cross. She was like, is that what you think of me? And I was like, what do you mean? And the presenter had read an extract out from the novel, and she'd read an extract out featuring the mother character of this sort of like really idiotic teenager. And it was like, wasn't a very warm piece, but it wasn't about my mum. It was just the character in the book who sort of seemed a bit like me. And my mum thought I'd gone on national radio to basically humiliate her, and she thought that this extract was about her. And we had an argument about it, and that was the last time I spoke to her. And I always felt for a really long time that like my grief was just frozen in that moment, and so I often feel like I'm seeking the approval of people who are not my mum, in that kind of weird quest to gain the approval of someone whose approval I can never get because they're no longer around, and because when they're around I didn't acknowledge it when it was given to me.
I mean, that is a cycle. Maybe is that just, I don't know if that's creatives or people who've lost parents. Like the amount of times in my life I've been like rowing with an older man, like really rowing about, like, you know, my boss or a director, and I'm standing there and I'm like so angry, and I'm like, why aren't they listening to me? And I think, oh, you're not my dad. Like, and it's like, oh no, oh shit. And then like all that stuff that you've had of like trying to gain their approval, or you know, all of this stuff, you just seek parents in other places. I think like it's just, I think we should all just be honest about it. Like it's fine, we all do it. And I've definitely got better at recognizing when it's happening. In my 20s I just endlessly like men in authority who I could like have a combative relationship with, who sort of seemed like they respected me but really didn't, and that was like, yes, this is really familiar territory. And it took me a long time to be like, oh, the person I want to have a row with is dead, and I can't, like, I'll never be able to have that row like we used to have such a very tempestuous relationship. We used to argue a lot, and we both really enjoyed it. We both really enjoyed a good row with each other, but the other one was ridiculous and didn't understand. And I think that can be a really sad part of the journey, but quite healing, to be like, oh, I'm looking for something that just isn't possible. And that's really hard, I think, when you've lost a parent, to be like, I will never get that person to say that. Like, the conversation is over. But I also find it, when I finally admitted it, I don't know how both of you feel about that, but I found it a bit freeing. So I was like, I actually don't really find those relationships in my life anymore, because I'm not looking for it, because I know that it isn't, I've accepted that with him, that I'm not going to have that with him. So I don't have to recreate the chaos somewhere else.
I think for me, I am still in the sort of slightly earlier part of that.
Yeah.
Whilst everything that I've done since my mum died has been like this kind of change of life, and it's been pursuing in part some things that she wasn't necessarily interested in. Like, she didn't bake. She would have thought I was mad for going to patisserie school. But she didn't write and wished she had been a writer, and I know that she kind of not so secretly wanted me and my sister to write. So everything that I've kind of done since she's died has been in pursuit of her approval and pride. And I know rationally that I cannot get that, but I would say I'm not yet at the healing stage. And I don't think I really seek my relationship with her with other people particularly. Especially since her sisters died subsequently. That was possibly the only real substitute there, but I don't have that anymore. Instead, what I do, which is really healthy, is I find everyone else in my life wanting it when they praise me, because I'm like, well, that's great, but it's not mum. And as the person who was hardest to impress, she is always the person that I want that from, and that has certainly not presented me in good lights. I've argued with my husband about it when I don't feel, you know, he's heaping praise on me, and I'm like, but it's not right. You're not saying right things, and of course he can't, because he's not the right person. And even my dad, who I'm really close to and is really proud, is not the right person.
Yeah,
he's not dead. So I think I am hopefully I will get to the healing stage, but right now I'm just at the really needy, antagonistic stage.
I don't work at that's, you know, it's wherever you're at, remember, it's fine, be kind to yourself. And I mean it took me a long time to, one, see I was doing it, accept I was doing it, stop doing it, recognizing it when it was happening again. Like, it took a long time. And I think, as ever with grief, I'm now not dealing with that, but it's been replaced with something else. Do you know what I mean? It's like, well, now I'm dealing with this. But I think I think, yeah. Oh, yeah. Maybe, you know, again, it's just time, isn't it? I think I just got to the point where I kept having this sort of weird, you know, dad substitutes that I was obviously trying to get that relationship. And then it was just like you said, I got fed up of being disappointed because I was like, there were so many, and it was just like, I mean, literally just like bosses and directors. It's easy for an actor to have a male person in authority telling you what to do. And I think eventually I just was like, what am I doing? Like, this, none of them are as interesting as he was. None of them are as interested in and who I am as he was. Like, actually, this is always going to be wanting. It's always going to be wanting. And because the person who, you know, cheerleaded you, it isn't there. And I think it can be hard, and perhaps we can all relate to this, I mean, he pushed me as well. So, like, I think sometimes it's hard for people to understand if you've lost someone who cheerleaded you but didn't necessarily think everything you did was amazing. Does that make sense? If, like, it was a tough love.
Yeah.
So that's quite hard to go out into the world and, like, be like, oh, the person who, you know, really pushed me and made me feel like sometimes I wasn't good enough, but also made me feel like I could do these things is gone. What do I do with that? Like, is that how do you do? Well, is that something you can relate to, Nikesh?
Yeah, and also, I think it's important to remember the stuff that made people difficult as well.
Yeah,
I do think it's very easy to kind of just romanticize people and like the best parts of them. But you know, my relationship with my mum was difficult, and I have to remind myself that it was difficult because we loved each other, and we didn't love each other unconditionally, because I'm not sure many people do love each other unconditionally, but we loved each other despite the best and worst of ourselves. And I think we probably just had the type of personalities that meant that we were always going to rub each other up the wrong way. And I think it's stood me in good stead to have a creative career, because it's made me very resilient in terms of wanting to keep going, even though, like, you know, as I'm sure you know, like, in the face of constant daily hourly
we can all relate to as creatives. Yeah.
I wonder what I've been rejected by in the hour that we've been recording this.
Yeah.
Can't wait to go back to my inbox. But I think that she kind of, that resilience to keep going because the sort of the telling of the stories, and the stories are more important than the platforms they may find. You know, the very function and act of telling stories is the thing that is more important than, you know, whether it's in the New Yorker or on your own blog. So I don't even think I'm answering your question.
No, you are, and I think it's really important to just be honest about how we process grief. And I think there is such a movement these days to be honest about it, which is amazing, because it certainly has changed in the 20 plus years that I've been living in the grief community. And, you know, I had a difficult relationship with my dad. I talk about that a lot on the show. And, you know, I think I still find it weird. I interviewed someone who was much, much older, like, you know, in their 90s. And when I told them about my dad, you know, she was very like, oh, he must have been wonderful. And you might, you know, all, like, her instant thought was like, oh, you're just this, he would have been so proud, and you would have been so proud, and wasn't he wonderful? And I was like, it's complicated. Like, but I think maybe people of our generation just find that a lot more helpful when you are dealing with your grief. Like, I find it really unhelpful if people tell me like he was amazing, or like that. And it's the same, I find, if people just blanketly say you're amazing. It's like, well, people are complex and they're much more flawed than that. And I feel like I can still talk about him and do a podcast based on what happened to him, but without being like the sort of broken daughter who just, you know, has a piece of her heart missing, which is not how I feel. Go on, Nikesh.
I was just going to say, I think it's definitely since men have been able to write complex superheroes who are both good and bad at the same time that have allowed us to deal with our own grief.
I think, thank you, all Batman origin stories, really.
Yeah, exactly. You know,
That-
remember when Batman was just a goodie?
I mean, I actually really loved the 1960s Batman where he was just a goodie, because I feel like my own life is full of complicated origin stories. I quite liked it when it was just kablam. You're like, great, this is what I'm watching. Yeah, so I mean, like, as we head to the end of our Dead Parent Club, is there anything else that you feel like, say somebody has, like, you know, is just brand new to this grief world, is there anything else that you would want them to know about being in the Dead Parent Club, or, you know, anything at all? It doesn't have to be, or anything we haven't covered yet, really.
Yeah, sorry, Olivia.
No, go on.
I find myself a decade on coming to terms with the fact that I'm angry with a lot of people who didn't give me the space to grieve in the way that I wanted them. I wanted to be held, almost. And I feel like I've held a grudge against them for a really long time, almost to the point where I feel like I've probably been unfair on them, because I've expected things from them that they don't necessarily know how to give me. And I'm not saying that, like, you know, they should have known when to reach out, and I should have felt supported enough to reach out when I needed to, because obviously life is much more messy than that. I guess the thing that I've had to really reckon with is, like, it's been 10 years, you don't have to still be mad at your cousin because you're you know.
I can very much relate to that, and again, perhaps this is time. I had almost like an Arya Stark list of people that had not fucking done their jobs, you know. And I definitely, as I got older, and especially after I had kids, I felt really like, you know what's really hard? It's really hard to talk about death. It's really hard, and it's very easy when it's your grief to be like, well, I'm grieving, like, this is my pain, what are you going to do with it? But when you're on the other side and you can just see someone in pain, it's very hard to, how do you help a 15-year-old girl that you don't know that well, you know? I mean, you knew her dad, but you don't know. And I've now got much more compassionate. I don't know if that's what you can relate to, Nikesh, of just being like, it's really hard, you probably did the best you could in the circumstances, and no, it wasn't what I needed, but, you know. Can you relate to that, Livy?
Yeah, I think the anger thing's really interesting. I am not a very angry person, or I'm not a very publicly angry person. So, with the exception of, like, arguing with my husband and maybe with my sister, I think even including my sister, like, I haven't shouted at anyone in the last 10 years, probably.
Wow. I've done your shouting, don't worry.
I just don't do it. And I think, you know, there's probably a certain amount of that comes from, I was always told when I was a barrister that I wore my heart on my sleeve and that was a bad thing, but I was never like angry. I didn't have a proper temper. And it took me a very long time to identify that so much of the unresolved grief within me was anger, and was anger not just towards myself for what I'd done, but like anger at my mum for things she'd done or hadn't done, and anger at people that I loved a lot. And it took me quite a lot of therapy to understand it's possible to hold anger for your grief and love for the person who's died at the same time. They are not in competition with one another. And actually sometimes it's only through kind of understanding and acknowledging that anger. Every time my therapist would try to talk to me about how angry I was, or if someone had behaved unfairly towards me, I would completely retreat from that and change the subject, because I didn't want to kind of apportion blame in what was effectively a blameless death. And I didn't know that you could just sit with your anger and sit with your unhappiness, and that was kind of how you process feelings, actually. And that just sweeping them away is at best temporary. So I think I kind of thought if I just tried really, really hard, the grief would get smaller and smaller. And actually it's what Nikesh said earlier, that it's a little, I mean, I think he said, you know, it's what they say about grief. It doesn't get smaller, you just get better at dealing with it. It doesn't get easier, but you get better at dealing with it. And it's like what you were saying, Cariad, about having this kind of hole in you that just exists the whole time, and it makes you feel incomplete. But I think if you allow yourself to sit with that sorrow and that anger, you can grow around it. And you can kind of absorb it into you in a way that you're not just missing a limb, which is how it feels when it first starts. But unfortunately, that's the really boring answer we keep coming back to, that it's just time. You have to learn how to sit with those things, and you have to learn how to grow around them, and how to be a person with a dead parent, but that doesn't necessarily stop you being a whole person.
Yeah, I think that's a very eloquently put.
Well, I think there were 9 metaphors in there, and none of them quite matched up or finished, but thank you.
No, I like them. I think, I mean, I don't know if you guys must have seen it, it's sometimes called ball in the box theory, it's sometimes called the fried egg theory, that, when you lose someone, like your whole life is just grief. And then what happens is life goes around, and so the grief is still there, but your life gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And the idea is that, like, grief it's not linear, it doesn't go away. It's like it will just stay there in your box, and your box just gets bigger. And when there's a Facebook thing that people are always sharing to me, that the BBC did a little 5-minute documentary, and I think if you type in ball in the box grief, you'll find it. But when I first saw that, I was like, it was the first time visually I was like, oh, like, because that to me is what people mean when they say time heals, like, or it takes time, or you'll get there, which when you're at the beginning of this journey, you're like what the hell am I supposed to do with that? It's so useless. I'm in agony, and you'll be like, you'll get a plaster in 5 years, good luck finding one. And you're like, what? That is it? But to see that it's like, oh, it doesn't go away, but you carry on, and you will have new experiences, and you will meet new people, and you will have you will have a life. But it doesn't mean that pain just stops existing, doesn't mean they were perfect, doesn't mean you were perfect, doesn't mean you're not angry, not sad. All of these things exist, in the yolk of that fried egg, which is another theorist coined that term. And I think I found that really helpful, just to be like, oh, I see, like, it is kind of a waiting game, but that also doesn't mean that your pain is just going to disappear. Because I think at the beginning you're like, oh right, well, when does it happen? When does the pain go? You're like, probably never, which is also like not what anyone wants to hear. But it's trying to understand that I think sometimes it's like, it's not that they're positives, but there is a resilience to this situation. And like you were saying, Libby, you are now someone with a dead parent, but like that doesn't mean you spend every day of your life weeping. You spend some days of your life weeping. Some days you're laughing, guys. Some days it's okay. And obviously I'm someone 20 plus years in, like my sad days are really few and far between. Like I really don't get them like nearly as much as I did at like 5, 8, 10, like 15. I think when they do come, they're a bit worse because they're a bit more shocking, because you haven't had one for ages, and you're just like, what is this? And it takes you a while to recognize it because you haven't had one for so long. So you're like, oh, I'm in a terrible mood. You're like, oh, an anniversary is coming up. Like, but I'm also much more resilient at dealing with them. And I think that's sort of all you can hope for, isn't it? I'm trying to end it positively. Is there a way of ending Dead Parent Club positively, apart from we've all got each other and that's what matters?
We've all got each other. I think the pain doesn't diminish, you just get bigger.
Yeah, thank you, Livy, for summing up my Nikesh, is there anything else you want to add to my rambles?
Also, as a parent, the pain doesn't go away, but you just get larger.
Yeah, literally on lockdown, I can attest to eating my way chocolate-wise through the pain. Now I can't smoke. If she's having a tantrum, I just go into the corner of the kitchen, eat chocolate. I'm like, yes, all right, mummy's fine now. Like, what did you want? Like inwardly, I'm like, oh my god. So yeah. So our advice seems to be eat your feelings and smoke. Is that what we're all?
That's the takeaway, right? Yeah. That's the takeaway.
That's the takeaway. If you missed the beginning, basically, Livy, your book, A Half-Baked Idea, is available to buy in paperback now, I believe, after doing your episode very recently. And it just won an award as well, won the Fortnum & Mason Award.
It did. It won Fortnum & Mason Debut Food Book Award.
Oh, very exciting. Nikesh, when is Brown Baby is out now? Is that right? Or coming out?
It's out in February. It was supposed to be out now, but then we moved it to February because 17 million books came out in September, apparently.
Amazing. It's a great time for writers, everyone. Buy books. It should be the biggest takeaway. Buy books. We need them. So Brown Baby is out in February, but also lots of the other books that you've already written, like The Good Immigrant and what's the other one? I was going to say, no, what's the one, the novel? What's it called?
There's one called The One Who Wrote Destiny and one called Meat Space.
There's another one.
Coconut Unlimited.
Okay, thank you. I was like, there's one called Coconut, and I didn't want to say it. I was like, it's not that, Cariad, don't say it. Coconut Unlimited. I knew that. I knew I had one that was called something Coconut. Okay. Nikesh, Brown Baby which is about grief and parenthood, is out in February, but you do have other books available to buy now if people can't wait till February. And yeah, my book is being pushed back, so wait for that. And the podcast is available, Griefcast is available to listen wherever you get your pods, basically. Just type in the Griefcast. Thank you so much for coming to Dead Parent Club. Nikesh and Libby, thank you so much for talking to me about Dead Parent Club.